Good evening.
It's kind of spooky outside. Well, it's supposed to rain,
It
so
is supposed to rain. It's supposed to thunderstorm. So,
the perfect weather.
perfect weather for spooky stories and spooky movies.
And here's the part where we tell you to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications.
Rebecca, you are our resident scary movie expert. Tell me about what it is that you like about scary movies. Like what makes you excited to watch a scary movie?
It's kind of like everybody wants to be a little scared sometimes, and right now it's kind of scary in like the real world. And sometimes it's nice to just be scared by fake things, by like monsters and ghosts and kind of like slashers.
What are some of your favorite horror movies, and what's the thing that resonates with you the most in a good horror piece?
Finding my favorite horror movie is so difficult because I feel like it changes all the time. Unlike some things, I don't consider Underworld a horror movie per se, but that's one of my very favorite movies, and it still has vampires and werewolves in it. But I really love Scream. The Scream movies are something I always come back to. They're very witty. The third one is just bonkers, but it's still really fun. And like watching characters progress is very interesting because you stick with some of the same main characters and you see how they grow. So I love those. I really enjoyed the remake of the Evil Dead because it got really gritty, gory, and gross. And I really was not expecting that at all. And I was really happy with that because the original is like kitschy and campy and gross, but this was like a horror movie. I really like The Conjuring 2. That is, I think, one of my favorite ghost movies. I think it's just so well done. The Conjuring series, the two Conjuring films about Lorraine Warren are great. Do not care for the spin-offs at all. But I think the thing that I like the most is just like I love a good like final girl. A good final girl is great. I guess most of the movies that I really enjoy have like a strong female presence, which even though like many people wouldn't consider horror very feminist, I personally do because you see these final girls. And if you could take Laurie Strode, who's the first final girl, who kind of is a wimpy final girl, but throughout Halloween, like turns into this total badass. And in the new remake, she is just like Jamie Lee Curtis is amazing. And like this, she's become this like intense woman who's like ready for Michael. She's got all these traps set up, and it's just I like watching. I like watching women kind of like finally win, but then I like got to thinking like these scary things, these fake scary things, are kind of based in reality, and it's very interesting to see that like what we as like a people, I guess mostly in the US because that's mostly the kind of horror I consume is the US horror, but like what we as a people are kind of scared of influences our horror films. The first sort of like scary story that we see throughout film and Hollywood is the fear of the other. And I watched actually this really awesome horror documentary called Horror Noire, which was fantastic, and I definitely recommend that. And it is about Black people representation in Hollywood. And they were talking about how, to them, the very first horror film was Birth of a Nation, because they had I believe he was a slave who was the antagonist. And to them, they were like, that's a monster. Like, that's not great. But it just sort of, unfortunately, like evolves from there. And we see a lot of Black people being used in scary imagery and like voodoo and things like that. And then it kind of starts boiling down to like monster films, like the Universal monsters. And they specifically point out the sky, the creature, from the Black Lagoon, who is sometimes known as the Gill Man or the Creature. And they specifically point out that he has sort of stereotypical features of what a lot of propaganda was featuring, like with the big lips and things at the time. And that was, to me, it kind of blew my mind. I never even thought about that at all when it came to the creature.
So the creature from the Black Lagoon being from the 30s, the Gill Man. What were those early horror movies like? Because I think a lot of people talk about how horror is kind of a reflection of society, but I think as a movie going culture, we have much more sophisticated storytelling attempts now. So tell me about Creature of the Black from the Black Lagoon. What is that production value like?
There are parts that it's very clear they spent a lot of time and effort on, like the Gilman makeup. The makeup in general is kind of, I would say, what makes these monster movies, because you can't have a scary monster without the makeup. So I personally think it's the makeup that they spend the most time and effort into, and that's what makes it scary. And it's a lot less about like the quality of the film. It's my personal opinion that I don't like The Creature of the Black Lagoon. I find it to be a little dull. I enjoy the makeup. It's actually the first woman makeup designer, Millicent Patrick, who did the makeup on that. And it was the first time they did underwater filming too, which was very interesting. I didn't know that. But to me, it's not the most exciting of monster movies.
So tell me about the sort of typical run of a monster movie, because I've seen The Wolfman, I've watched a lot of vampire movies, I've watched a lot of zombie movies. What is the overarching plot of a monster movie?
So typically it's something like Joe Schmo, kind of plain guy normally, is going somewhere or like visiting somewhere. It's usually going to a castle, going to visit someone, going on like an expedition. And it's a little different in Frankenstein because that's about also a mad scientist. And same with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because those are sciencey. But it's typically like Joe Schmo goes somewhere, encounters a monster, and then either has to convince someone to help him kill the monster or becomes the monster in the case of the Wolfman. And eventually it's like it's very like cut paste good and evil, monster bad, this person good.
So the idea that you have this very clear cut and dry good and evil is very interesting when we look at The Wolfman, because that's definitely a movie where um, you have the character of Larry Talbot, right? Who is a good guy, sort of. He's a little aggressive when it comes to women, but he's, our protagonist. He's our hero. And he is also this ravaging, raving monster who's killing people. And I think one of the things that I saw in the research that I did, a very minor research that I did, was that it was one of the first movies where we see that sort of duality where the monster is also the victim. Like he's a bad guy, but he's not a bad guy.
The really interesting thing about that is how it was actually written by Carl Seidemek, and he is of Jewish descent. And so there's this very similar to like a story of being Jewish, and he was from Germany. The werewolf is marked by a star, and there was, of course, the marking of the Star of David. And it's sort of like out of your control that you are being hunted down and assumed a monster, and like you could hurt those around you just by being something that you have no control over.
I think that comes out like I don't think it's super apparent if you're watching it and you don't have any context, but when you have the context and you see that pentagram, which is very similar to a Star of David, like on the guy's chest, on, the hands of his victims, it's like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, that's pretty, that you were very clear about what this is.
The werewolf is my favorite movie monster. They unfortunately don't get the credit they deserve.
I agree with that. I mean, come on, guys. We all love dogs. I love dogs.
They're the perfect pet. Not pet, I'm sorry. They're the perfect friend, like, for a dog, for a person.
I would love that. I'm not going to lie.
So, like, if you're a little sad, like, I want you to go in dog mode now, please.
So that I can snuggle.
See, that's perfect. I do want to, like, kind of jump ahead to the 90s and point out Candyman. He's technically a slasher, but I put him in Fear of the Other because he's the first black slasher. He's actually the first black antagonist that we've seen in like I said, the slasher, which is very interesting because the director actually contacted the NAACP and said, "Hey, I want to make this movie. Is this okay?" And it was actually based on a Clive Barker short story, and they changed the setting from England to Chicago. Chicago is incredibly racially diverse, but it's also unfortunately, one of the most segregated cities in terms of like, this is the black neighborhood, Latinx neighborhood, and the Gold Coast, which if you're from Illinois or Chicago, is the white neighborhood basically. And the story of Candyman is very interesting because it is an urban legend essentially who is like brought to life by saying Candyman 5 times in a mirror, and which I will never do. I won't push my luck. Tony Todd, who plays Candyman, is very hypnotic in the role, and he's amazing. But the problem that they have in that film is sort of like a white savior complex, where you have the character of Helen who ends up semi-saving the day, because Candyman is terrorizing Cabrini Green, which was, I guess, the project, like the housing project in Chicago. And there were a lot of people who were confused as to why he would be terrorizing them when, like, the whole backstory of Candyman is he's killed by white people for loving a white woman. So they were in like an interracial relationship, and they were like, nope, none of that. So why would you haunt Cabrini Green when you can go to Gold Coast, which is just down the street, and haunt the white people? So I enjoy Candyman a lot, and I think it's a really, really fun film. But I understand where the problems lie. And I'm very interested because Nia DaCosta is actually directing, and it's going to be produced by Jordan Peele, what they called it, the spiritual sequel to Candyman. So that will be interesting. One thing I really enjoyed in the new Candyman trailer is a black couple is talking. They're like, who would ever want to summon Candyman? And then it like cuts to a group of like white high school girls all summoning him in a mirror, and it was just like, that's fun. I enjoyed it.
That sounds right. So let's talk about slasher movies, because that's kind of our next wave of horror, right? We go from the monster movies of the 50s and the 60s into kind of the slasher movies of the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s.
The slashers are a very interesting idea because it's less of a fear of like a person and more of because everything used to be in a city. There was a city horror, and then all of a sudden this is all in the suburbs now. It's more of a home invasion kind of thing, and that home invasion idea comes like all the way into now. Like that's sort of the idea that's really stuck with horror now, and home invasion in the sense that like you should be safe in your own home. But then there comes the slasher here, and I'll take Michael Myers as a example because he doesn't really have a motive in the movie. It's more like, I saw you at my house where I murdered someone and I was younger, so I'm gonna attack you. So there's no motive, which I think is the scarier part.
I feel like that's kind of a reversion back to the idea that like you have this clear cut good guy and this clear cut bad guy, and there's no real digging into that. Like watching Halloween, they do that first scene that's set like 20-30 years in the before the events of the movie start, and you just have this like 8-year-old kid who decides to kill his sister for what? For what?
I feel like I've also experienced that, and I think it's definitely like John Carpenter, who did Halloween, also actually did the music for Halloween, which I think is really cool, but because it's so simple. But I do think like there's this sort of like the mixing. Once again, it was like done on a dirt cheap budget. Like the fact that they didn't have they didn't know what to do with Michael Myers, so they actually got a William Shatner mask from a Halloween store from his role in Star Trek, and they just ripped out the eyes and painted it white. So that's the kind of budget that we're working with here.
I find that very endearing. Like that part of horror where it's just a group of people who are, trying to make this thing that they love any way possible. I find that super endearing. And do you know much about the making of Night of the Living Dead?
I know that was Romero, and I know I don't know about like a much of the process. I know that it was. I know in terms of casting, I know they did cast a black man to be a lead and a powerful role, and he just said, "Oh, he was the best in the audition." So he wasn't, he was great. He wasn't like trying to make a political statement, but he saw, oh my gosh, this guy's the best. So then, and he didn't carry it, whatever. He just that one didn't have as much of a budget either. It's a lot of the very famous horror films. They have like zero budget. Evil Dead had no budget. And that is just shot like I think in a couple weekends and like grueling hours. And I think all their effort went into like the effects and things like that. And that's something you see a lot. But the thing that I think is really funny about the slasher films is even though it's kind of like a poo-poo genre, all these slashers have like puritanical values because they are killing the people who are drinking and partying and who are having premarital sex. So it's very clear all of these slashers grew up in the town where Footloose takes place, like pre Kevin Bacon, like no dancing, no fun, no no nothing, because they are only like the good, pure, virginal girl. The final girl would be like the last one standing, which is so weird. But that all changes in the 90s.
Did you ever watch Boy Meets World when you were a kid?
Off and on,
Did
yes.
you ever see the episode that they did that was a spoof on Scream? Because that episode is fantastic, and it is an episode that like I have like memorized certain scenes from, and they all play different roles, and they talk about, so Sean plays the character who is like, I've seen every horror movie, I know exactly what's gonna happen, and he's the it's good, it's great, it's a great episode. I recommend, if you watch no other episode of Boy Meets World, watch that one episode, probably on Disney Plus.
The idea of the other two, which can be something that you see throughout the entire history of horror, kind of goes into another theme that I saw, which is like the fear of the atomic age. So there's this horrible fear of the atomic age and everything that happened after World War II with the bombing, and there was sort of no idea of what effects that could have on people. And when you have nuclear powers, people start to kind of freak out. So sci-fi and horror, you start seeing this huge influx of things like Them, which was giant bugs and because of radiation. And you even see it with Godzilla. I mean, Godzilla is technically, in the 90s version, we technically created it with like the idea of nuclear war. But in the original version, the Japanese version, it was sort of like we destroyed the world, and now nature was going to come back and destroy us. Was sort of how it was framed. And then there's things like Attack of the Giant Gila Monster and Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. So there's just so many, like this fear of this other thing that nobody knows anything else about, and how that's going to affect how we look and live our life.
I feel like a lot of these are fears that we still have today, because like the idea, the fear of the other, that's always scary. The fear of nature coming back to like get us, that's definitely a thing, especially because, global warming, and they're not dead tropes, right? We still have Godzilla movies coming out. We still have he has his own like cinematic universe that's coming out soon. So it's definitely that monster movie that it hits as something that is, I think, very basic in us, right? And I would almost say that, especially for these sort of nature coming back to get us movies, right, where we have these giant monsters, these monsters that we create that turn on us. It's almost like this admission that we haven't been taking care of things the way that we should have. So like, are we the bad guys in those movies?
100%. And even like, I'll bring up The Happening, which is by no means a good movie in any way, shape, or form.
I
But
saw
that's
that
lovely.
in theaters.
It's the quintessential nature fights back film, but in like a really lame way. I think it could have been done much better.
I think my favorite part about that movie was all of the shots of menacing trees that are just blowing in the wind, like long shots of just leaves rustling. Just
There's the zombie movie The Dead Don't Die was also sort of about that, because it was like we had like driven the planet to like to be just slightly off, and so then the dead started just coming back to life.
well, and I thought about that because I saw The Dead Don't Die before I watched Night of the Living Dead. And the thing that surprised me about Night of the Living Dead is that they blame it on radiation from Venus, from like experiments we're doing on Venus, and that just came out of left field, but it made me think of The Dead Don't Die, where like it's not some mystical thing, it's not some disease, right? It is we messed around with radiation, we messed around with like the planet's ecosystem, and now we have zombies for some reason. Who knows? Who knows?
It's funny because like that's like one of the it's not the first zombie film. That's White Zombie, but it's still kind of scary even though they're so slow. It's not until I think the early 2000s, and I remember very clearly when they, I believe, remade Night of the Living Dead, and the zombies were all of a sudden running and they were fast. And I remember sitting at home being like, "Whoa, this changes everything."
The zombies in Night of the Living Dead, not that slow, man. They're pretty damn spry. So I don't know why we thought all zombies like shuffle and mumble. Those guys, they were on it.
The other thing about specifically that movie is a good segue, because the other sort of fear that we saw, especially during the Cold War, was communism. And the Night of the Living Dead is kind of a metaphor for communism. It's people who you know and love turning into something different, and there's like this huge horde of people, and they're all like slowly coming to get you, Barbara. Even it extends out from horror. You get Red Dawn as a figure of communism, and then the biggest one of the horror sci-fi ones is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where literally an alien like assumes your body and like you and everything, and then it seems exactly like you, except it's not. And that there's the fear of like, you don't know who's in the room with you. And the same thing sort of goes with the movie The Thing, which is another John Carpenter film, and really, really kind of too much like Quarantine, because all these guys are stuck in a base together, and then they have unearthed the thing, and the thing can kill and consume you and then become you as well. So it's just sort of like you can't trust anybody, because who knows, your friend could be a communist or an alien or
Yeah, watching any movie these days where someone is stuck in a house is a little too real, especially Night of the Living Dead, because like there's disease out there, and should I have boarded up my windows like a while ago? I don't know.
throughout horror, while we also have the same sort of themes, we have our times to shine for certain monsters, and it was like vampires and werewolves were really big, and they weren't. I wouldn't necessarily say like super like in the horror genre. I'd say everything, especially when Twilight came out. Like vampires and werewolves were like really cool for everybody at that point.
Well, because then it's kind of that natural progression of like you have your bad guy is definitely a bad guy, and then you have your bad guy is a bad guy but he's a victim, and then you have your bad guy is sexy. Like it's this sort of natural progression from, you know, these were evil scary creatures, now they're kind of desirable, like, oh, he's just that bad boy in class with a motorcycle and maybe I can fix him.
I like the book and the movie Warm Bodies, because they tried to do the like zombie thing. It's kind of like a rom-com, and I liked I thought it was
I
funny.
really loved the movie Warm Bodies. I thought it was very like wholesome and I really enjoyed it. I know I did try to start reading the book and it's a little bit different. It's maybe a lot a bit different than the movie. What are the differences?
It's been a while. Let's see. I know that his friend is a lot younger than him because his friend and her friend end up getting together, actually. And it's definitely like the people showing affection to each other definitely does warrant. Like, that's the cure, is like the cure is being good to one another. Like, what a shocker.
Listen, did I not say this earlier today? All of these movies can be boiled down to this idea that there is an other who is out to get us, or that we are the other and someone is coming to get us. And maybe the cure for all of this, maybe the end to horror movies, is just that we love each other like we're supposed to. Did I not say that earlier today?
You did. You're on it. But going back to our slashers and our home invasion, which is still like the home invasion still is a thing, even if you think about like ghosts are invading your home, people are invading your home, and they can all be metaphors for something. But what I really like is, well, I'll start with most of these films are predominantly made by like white people, so they are white fears. That's just how, especially white men. It's been in horror, the white men basically run horror. That is changing with Jordan Peele, which we talked about with Candyman, which I'm very excited about. But then you have Get Out and Us, and I was talking to you today, and I'm saying they're both home invasion films in the sense, because Get Out is mostly about like it's someone else invading your body, unwarranted, and Us is literally like the flip side, I guess, the mirror version of you invading. So like your badness invading your goodness.
I
So
also was thinking about Get Out as like an other fear, a fear of otherness, because you have Chris, who is the other in the scenario, and then you also have Chris, who views his girlfriend's family as the other, and her family's friends as the other, and this fear of them, and then this idea that maybe they are afraid of him. But then we actually see that sort of progression where these white people who might have traditionally been afraid of the monster are now kind of like, no, the monster's sexy, the monster is hot, I want to be the monster, and they take that to a really wild end. Spoiler alert for that movie. Sorry to anybody who hasn't seen it. But honestly, if I've seen Get Out, if I've seen a horror movie, why haven't you seen a horror movie?
because I mean, it's old.
It's been several years.
Yeah, so I feel like we won't. It's fine.
Okay.
You should have watched it by now.
Yes, you should have. We live in a scary time. What do you see coming out of right now? Like, what does the horror movie of 2021 look like when we can finally open up production and film them?
I think we're definitely going to see a lot of found footage films, which is not my particular favorite type of horror, but it's a really easy way to get things done cheaply. Well, not actually cheaply. It takes a lot of effort to do a found footage, but it just kind of looks cheaper. I think we're going to see a lot of zombies, particularly coming from like a Contagion sort of thing where, and it travels, and very similar to, I guess, Zombieland, because Zombieland, what the whole idea was, it came from mad cow disease. So I think kind of similar to that. I think we'll also see a lot more ghost stuff coming too, because the idea of being trapped in a house during quarantine, you can't like leave. So I think ghosts are going to have another big surge, like Paranormal Activity style.
What would you direct if you could direct any horror movie?
Ooh, I have like 3 in the back of my head that I was like, this is what I would do. But the current one that I was like, this would work now, is a zombie film. It's a very small town, and a bunch of vaccines, like flu vaccines, are flown in and every person needs to take their flu vaccine. And it actually turns out that it's the government testing to see if they can make zombies and control zombies, but they don't. They can't. So they end up bombing the town at the end.
My horror film would probably turn into an underworld situation where it's like, yes, we started out with monsters that were a little bit scary, but now everybody's in love with each other. We get to the end of this horror movie, and let's hope it's a happy ending, and our
Like
protagonists get their good ending, and our antagonists get their bad ending, and then we move on with our lives. That's what I hope to see in the future of horror.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah. Let's roll credits, guys. Roll credits.
If you like today's video, make sure to give us a thumbs up. Remember to hit that subscribe button so you stay informed whenever we release new episodes.